This is a video of skydivers jumping out of a plane after a pilot lost control and part of the tail of the aircraft broke off in flight. However, this is only the beginning of our story, and that's because a few years later, 10 skydivers boarded the exact same airplane, but unfortunately this time they didn't have a chance to get out, and this was all that was left of the wreckage. Before I begin, I need to warn you that this tragedy is probably the most disturbing story that I've shared on this channel, and I'm not saying that to be dramatic. I just know the story is going to make a lot of you upset because it made me very angry because there was no excuse for what happened, especially when you find out who was involved in some of the things they did. That's why I've gone through about 1,000 pages of the investigation, so that way I can share with you the facts about the reckless mistakes that everyone made that got 10 skydivers killed. We have a lot to talk about, so let's get started. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your pilot debrief. One of the most important things we can do for any tragedy is to take a moment to remember the victims. Late afternoon on June 21st, 2019, 10 skydivers boarded a plane in Hawaii hoping to get one last jump before sunset. As soon as they got airborne, the pilot began a left-hand turn, and unfortunately the aircraft started rolling to the left and crashed inverted near the edge of the highway. These are the 10 skydivers that perished in what was the deadliest skydiving plane crash in over 20 years and one of Hawaii's worst civil aviation disasters. On board the plane were skydiving instructors, guys that were just jumping for fun, and a married couple celebrating their first anniversary by going on their first skydiving adventure. I can't even begin to tell you how awful this was, and my heart goes out to their friends and families. The man flying the plane and responsible for their safety was 42-year-old Jerome Rink. We're going to talk a lot more about him later, as well as everyone else who played a role in this. But first, every story has a beginning, and to understand how this happened, we have to go back almost 3 years to the first mishap involving the aircraft. Our story begins on July 23, 2016, in a small town called Byron, California, where 14 skydivers boarded a 1967 King Air to make a routine jump. Now, the pilot flying the plane had about 1,800 hours of total time, but he only had about 20 hours of experience flying the King Air and only 130 hours in multi-engine aircraft. Additionally, the NTSB never said how much experience the pilot had with skydiving operations, but my guess is that it wasn't much. As the aircraft was climbing through 12,000 feet, the pilot let the airspeed get too slow, and when he started a left turn, he exceeded the critical angle of attack and stalled, and the aircraft began to spin. According to the aircraft manual, as soon as you enter a spin, you're supposed to immediately push forward on the controls, apply full rudder opposite the direction of the spin, and reduce the engine power to idle. And you want to do all three of those things as simultaneously as possible. Unfortunately, the pilot didn't do that. According to one of the jumpers that was sitting in the co-pilot's seat, the pilot didn't retard the throttles during the recovery, and this caused the aircraft to develop too much speed. Somehow the pilot was able to regain control for a brief second, but then the aircraft re-entered the spin. As the skydivers were getting tossed around due to the forces from the spin, they were doing their best to get out of the plane. That's when there was a loud bang and the aircraft shook. The reason that happened was because the aircraft was going too fast and the right horizontal stab and elevator broke off in flight. In fact, later in the video, you can see that part of the aircraft falling through the air, passing just below one of the skydivers. After all the skydivers got out of the plane, the pilot regained control, and then he entered a third spin before somehow he was finally able to recover and successfully land the aircraft. One of the contributing factors to this mishap was the fact that with 14 skydivers on board, the aircraft's center of gravity was 6 to 7 units beyond the aft limit. Now, this is just the first of many reckless mistakes in this story, because anytime you have an aft center of gravity, the aircraft is going to be less stable, and that's also going to make it more difficult to recover from a stall or a spin. And my guess is that if the skydivers hadn't jumped out of the plane during that second spin, chances are the pilot wouldn't have been able to recover. Now that you know what happened with the first mishap, we need to talk about the aircraft owner and how the aircraft got from California out to Hawaii. Patrick was the owner of the aircraft, and he had purchased it back in 2011, and he had been leasing it to a skydiving business in California when it was involved in the spin mishap. Now, because the damage was so significant, it took him about a year to get the aircraft repaired. Unfortunately, the NTSB discovered that the part that was used to replace the right horizontal stab wasn't an acceptable replacement. Additionally, there should have been a major repair record filed with the FAA, but that never happened, and even though the left wing had been twisted during the mishap, it was never repaired. Essentially, what happened was that a certified mechanic signed off on the repairs, but after he inspected the aircraft, he said the aircraft was found to be in an unairworthy condition, basically meaning it's not safe to fly. However, less than 2 weeks later, another mechanic signed off saying that all of the issues had been resolved. Now, when the NTSB went to interview the mechanic who oversaw the repairs, they learned that he was stationed out of country and they couldn't reach him to answer any questions. Regardless, after the repairs were signed off, Patrick decided to lease the aircraft to a skydiving company located in Hawaii called the Oahu Parachute Center. When the aircraft was flown from California out to Hawaii, pictures during that flight showed that the left aileron trim tab was in the full left wing down position, which is something I'll talk more about later. And you can also see wrinkles in the aircraft's skin on the top of the left wing. When the NTSB asked Patrick about the wrinkles, he said that a mechanic told him that this was typical for an older plane, but the truth was that the NTSB found photos taken before the spin accident that didn't show any wrinkles on the left wing. Either way, the Oahu Parachute Center was going to be the ones flying the aircraft, so they should have done a thorough inspection as soon as they got the plane, and they probably should have recognized some of these issues. That's because the NTSB said there were clear signs of structural damage that were never repaired, including evidence the left wing was still twisted, some of the panels didn't align properly, and there was a non-uniform gap between the left prop spinner and the engine cowl. The investigation would go on to reveal several shocking details about the operations at the Oahu Parachute Center that I'm going to cover in a minute, but right now we need to talk about the pilot that was going to be the one flying the plane in Hawaii. Jerome Rank was 42 years old, and he was the pilot that crashed the plane, killing 10 skydivers on board. And when it comes to his background, this was by far the most non-standard pilot history that I've ever seen. On April 22, 2017, a few months before the mishap aircraft was flown out to Hawaii, Jerome began his aviation journey with his first flight. About 6 weeks later, he failed his private pilot check ride, but he passed on the second try. A few months later, he failed his instrument check ride, but again, he passed on the next try. Now, this is where things start to get interesting because normally the next step for a pilot would be to get your single-engine commercial license, but instead, in December of that year, Jerome took a check ride to get a multi-engine commercial rating. He ended up failing that evaluation for numerous reasons, but not surprisingly, he would pass on the next try. The fact that in less than 8 months he had 3 check ride failures and he went from being a single-engine private pilot to a multi-engine commercial pilot led the NTSB to take a closer look at his training history. That's when they discovered that Jerome was doing his training with a flight school called Ritter Aviation, where his flight instructor was also the owner of the company. He started off flying a Piper PA-28, which is a single-engine aircraft, where he logged 4.6 hours of flight time over his first 6 flights. But then on his very next flight, he logged 7.8 hours of multi-engine time on a cross-country commercial flight in a King Air C-90. And for some reason, he counted all of that time as pilot in command of the aircraft. First of all, the pilot in command is the person in charge of the operation of the aircraft and responsible for the safety of everyone on board, so I'm not sure how you can say that someone with less than 5 hours of total flight time in a single-engine aircraft is capable of being the PIC of a multi-engine aircraft the very first time he flew it. Second of all, if you're a student pilot, you need an instructor endorsement to fly solo before you can start logging PIC time. And Jerome didn't get that solo endorsement until over a month later when he did his first solo flight in the Piper Archer. Now, the NTSB didn't really address this discrepancy, but that's probably because there were so many other problematic issues they discovered. Keep in mind that the King Air C-90 is a multi-engine complex aircraft, and although it's possible, it's not something that I've ever heard of being used for training brand new student pilots. Most students are going to start with the basics and learn the fundamentals of single-engine aircraft before they start flying something like a King Air. Unfortunately, what was happening was Jerome was doing flights in both the Piper PA-28 and the King Air at the same time, going back and forth between the two aircraft. So by the time he got his private pilot license for single-engine aircraft, he had logged 43 hours in the King Air. One of the reasons why Jerome was doing some of his training on the King Air was because the flight school owner, who remember was also Jerome's instructor, He had been hired by a fruit company to use the King Air to do some commercial flights for them. So what was happening was the instructor would take Jerome with him on these cross-country commercial flights, sometimes with passengers in the back, and Jerome would log all of these hours, counting all of that time towards the experience he needed to get his commercial certificate later on down the road. There were obviously a lot of questions about the legalities of all of this, and that's why the FAA lawyers issued a statement saying that student pilots can log flight time that counts towards a commercial certificate as long as the pilot is being trained and evaluated at the commercial pilot level. However, they didn't give an opinion about whether that was the case with Jerome or not. When they looked at Jerome's logbook, they found some of his flights in the King Air were logged as first officer training, but because that isn't a term used in the FAA regulations, it's not clear what that meant. The NTSB tried to interview Jerome's instructor to learn more, but unfortunately he wouldn't respond, so they issued him a subpoena, and as far as I know, they never got the answers they wanted. Eventually, the NTSB determined that it was unlikely that Jerome received any meaningful training during these flights in the King Air, and they were most likely conducted by the flight instructor with Jerome sitting in the co-pilot seat. In my opinion, it sounded like Jerome wanted to get through training as quickly as possible. He had a background as an investment banker, and he had perfect or near perfect scores on all of his written evaluations as a pilot. And this is where it's important to understand that just because you do well on a written exam, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a great pilot. Now, I'm not saying this to attack Jerome, but rather the truth is that the instructor is ultimately the one responsible for keeping their students on a normal path of progression, emphasizing the need to learn the fundamentals and gain enough experience before the student is able to take that next step in their aviation journey. The bottom line is there aren't any shortcuts to gaining the experience you need to safely operate an aircraft. According to Jerome's logbook, after he got his commercial license, he spent roughly the next year and a half flying a Piper Aztec, conducting aerial observation flights until he applied for a job to be a King Air pilot for the Oahu Parachute Center in Hawaii. At that time, Jerome had 872 hours of total flight time. That means on paper, Jerome might have looked qualified for the job because he had a lot of multi-engine time, but the truth is he only had 53 hours in the King Air, and all of that was time that he had logged over a year and a half ago when he was a student pilot. At this point, we have an unairworthy aircraft being used for skydiving operations, and now we're going to combine that with a pilot that has a questionable training history and not a lot of experience flying the King Air, and the story is only going to get a whole lot worse. Before we get to the next part, I want to say that between flying for the airlines and working on videos, life can get pretty busy, and sometimes I need an easy go-to meal solution, and that's why I love Factor, and I want to thank them for sponsoring today's video. If you're not familiar with Factor, they deliver nutritious meals that are fresh, never frozen, right to your doorstep. Everything comes pre-packaged, and I like having plenty of options to choose from, and they're very easy to make. All you do is poke a few holes on the top and toss it in the microwave for 2 minutes, and it's ready. This one is my favorite so far. This is the jalapeno lime chicken, but they have something for everyone. That's because there's more to Factor than just lunches and dinners. From easy breakfast and smoothies to delectable midnight snacks, Factor has over 60 add-ons to help keep you fueled and focused 24/7, and with a plethora of flavors, you'll never get bored. This fall, you've got a lot going on outside the kitchen. Keep your plans and turn to Factor. They deliver fresh, nutritious, chef-prepared meals ready to eat in just 2 minutes. Head to factor75.com or click the link below and use the code PILOT50 to get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off your next month of orders. That's code PILOT50 at factor75.com to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month of orders. One of the central parts of this investigation was the Oahu Parachute Center in Hawaii. The owner of the company, whose name was George, used to have a private pilot certificate, but according to the FAA records, that was revoked in 2011 for violation of 2 different regulations. The first basically says you have 60 days to report motor vehicle actions to the FAA, and the second one said you can't make a fraudulent or intentionally false statement when you apply for a medical certificate. That being said, George was a master parachute rigger, and he was well known in the skydiving community and had been involved with skydiving for over 30 years. When he started the Oahu Parachute Center in 2017, he leased the King Air from Patrick to begin operations, and allegedly to help keep costs low, all of the pilots and the aircraft mechanic were contract workers. However, the NTSB was never provided with a copy of any of those contracts. Jerome started working as a King Air pilot at the Oahu Parachute Center in early March of 2019, about 3 months prior to the deadly crash. And the most important thing you need to know about when he started his training was that the company didn't have any sort of structured training program to ensure that their pilots were proficient in flying the King Air or jump operations before conducting flights. The NTSB interviewed several pilots that had flown for the Oahu Parachute Center in the past. One of them, who had about 1,000 hours in the King Air but wasn't a flight instructor, said that he was told to take new pilots and teach them how to start the engines, taxi and take off, fly the jump run, and then land. He also said the company couldn't afford to take the airplane off the line just for training. In fact, he told investigators that most of their training was watching King Air Academy videos on YouTube and not hands-on training. When it comes to Jerome, his training consisted of 2 flights from another pilot named Rick, who was a certified flight instructor. His first flight was on March 9th, and Rick had Jerome sit in the co-pilot seat so that way he could watch him perform a few jump runs, and then they swapped seats for Jerome to do the rest. The reason this is important is because the aircraft didn't have a yoke on the co-pilot side. So for part of these training flights, Jerome was likely just sitting there because he didn't have any way to manipulate the flight controls from the right seat. Rick said that Jerome received training regarding the minimum control speed with the critical engine inoperative, and they performed takeoff exercises, steep turns, and they also did the usual stuff, including watching the King Air videos on YouTube. Over the next 3 months, Jerome flew 82 days, averaging 2.3 hours of flight time each day, giving him about 190 hours in the King Air with the company at the time of the crash. And now that you understand what was going on with Jerome and the pilots at this company, we need to talk about the maintenance of the aircraft. If you remember from earlier, when the aircraft was flown from California to Hawaii, the pilot was using full left wing down trim. That's because, according to the NTSB, the left wing was never repaired after the July 2016 spin accident, and the airplane required full left wing down trim to fly straight and level. Some of the pilots that flew for the Oahu Parachute Center knew about the trim issue, but there's no evidence it was ever documented in the aircraft logbook, and nothing was ever done to investigate further or possibly fix the problem. Multiple photos and videos showed full left wing down trim being used on numerous occasions, and the aircraft wreckage revealed Jerome had full left wing down trim when he crashed. This is where Bobby comes into our story. Bobby was the guy responsible for the contract maintenance on the aircraft. Unfortunately, despite the trim issues, the wrinkles on the left wing, and other signs of potential structural problems, Bobby said everything worked smoothly and there weren't any flight control problems or other issues with the aircraft. When it came to routine aircraft maintenance, Bobby said that pilots would usually just tell him if something was wrong and then he would go fix it. However, he never wrote any of that down, so there wasn't really any record of that. And that's why the NTSB asked him how he was getting paid if he wasn't keeping records of the work that he was doing, and he told them that everything was just done verbally, and usually he would just text Patrick, the aircraft owner, and Patrick would pay him. When it comes to the maintenance logbooks, the NTSB discovered that in December of 2017, there was a Phase 1 inspection signed off, but the Phase 1 checklist wasn't completed. 9 months later, there was a Phase 3 inspection that was also signed off, even though some of the tasks related to the flight control system weren't completed. Additionally, one of the maintenance requirements was to perform a daily engine compressor wash to prevent corrosion due to the salty atmosphere, since they were located right next to the ocean. Unfortunately, there weren't any logbook entries documenting this, and when the NTSB asked Bobby about it, he said that Jerome was doing the washes and some of the maintenance, which wasn't legal since Jerome didn't have training or a certificate allowing him to do that. The NTSB tried to follow up with Bobby, but they never heard from him again. They later discovered that Bobby had an airplane and power plant certificate and an inspection authorization that were revoked in 2005 due to the falsification of aircraft records. However, those were reissued in 2015 and 2017 respectively after he underwent a re-examination. That being said, the NTSB made one more shocking discovery about Bobby. And I'm going to be honest, because I know I keep saying the word shocking, but I'm not sure else how to describe some of this story, because if I didn't have the NTSB reports to prove it, you probably wouldn't believe me. The unfortunate truth is that about 8 months after this skydiving tragedy, another fatal accident occurred at the same airfield where Bobby had been hired to provide maintenance for a Cessna 305 for a different company. In that tragedy, the NTSB determined that inadequate maintenance was the reason why the plane crashed. But you should know that after this second crash, the FAA initially suspended Bobby's A&P certificate pending a re-examination, but they have since revoked his certificate permanently. In a tragic twist, one of the pilots that died in that crash was a man named Rick Rogers, who happened to be the same pilot that trained Jerome. At this point, almost all the holes in the Swiss cheese have lined up, or some might argue that there were actually more holes than cheese in this tragedy. Either way, we need to talk about what happened on the day of the crash. Late afternoon on June 21st, 2019, Jerome was getting ready to taxi out for takeoff with 8 skydivers on board the aircraft. At the very last minute, 2 more jumpers showed up. They were supposed to be on the next flight, but because they got there early, they hopped on board, and now there were 10 skydivers in the aircraft ready to go. When it came to the weight and balance of the aircraft, the Oahu Parachute Center pilots were using a generic formula that assumed 160 gallons of fuel and an average weight of 190 pounds per person for 13 passengers. This gave them a baseline to operate off of, but the only problem was that the formula didn't account for the weights of any of the parachute systems, which weighed between 25 and 58 pounds. The NTSB determined that as a result, the aircraft was continuously flown at weights higher than what the pilot anticipated and with a center of gravity that was near or possibly beyond the aft limit on most flights. At the time of the crash, they were taken off to the east using runway 08, which is about 9,000 feet long. However, the runway has a 2,000 foot displaced threshold at each end with 5,000 feet in the middle. The drop zone for the skydivers was located just off the departure end of the runway, and the Oahu Parachute Center was just to the south of that. The airfield procedures required pilots to depart to the north, and they weren't supposed to fly over the drop zone. Additionally, they were required to depart over the beach park and avoid flying over the trees because those were considered noise-sensitive areas. When Jerome taxied out for takeoff, he had 3 options. Even though there's a displaced threshold, he could still go all the way down to the end and use the full length of the runway for takeoff. His next option would be to start at the displaced threshold, and that would give him about 7,000 feet remaining, and that was the standard practice that all of the pilots used. The third option was an intersection takeoff that provided about 4,500 feet of runway. That's still more than enough room, but here's the problem. The King Air requires a takeoff distance of about 1,750 feet to clear a 50-foot obstacle. It's only about 2,100 feet from the intersection to the point abeam the end of the beach park. That means if you perform an intersection takeoff, you don't have a lot of room, and it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to complete a turn to the north to overfly the beach park and avoid the noise-sensitive areas. One of the challenges to this investigation was that the aircraft wasn't equipped with a cockpit voice recorder or a flight data recorder. Additionally, radar data wasn't available for this flight due to how low to the ground the aircraft was for the brief time it was airborne. That's why the NTSB had to rely on what they found in the wreckage and also what the eyewitnesses saw. Before I tell you what the witnesses saw and explain the real reason why they crashed, there's one more thing you need to know. But first, I need to warn you that if you're already angry about what you've heard so far, this is just going to make things worse. According to the Hawaii Department of Transportation, George, the owner of the Oahu Parachute Center, had a permit to rent space at the airfield for his parachute packing company called Hawaii Parachute Center. On April 16, 2019, about 2 months before the crash, the Department of Transportation sent a cease and desist letter to George saying that, first of all, the Oahu Parachute Center wasn't a registered tenant at the airfield and didn't have a permit to conduct skydiving operations. Keep in mind that somehow they had been conducting skydiving operations at the airfield for over 2 years at this point without anyone noticing they didn't have a permit. Second, the Hawaii Parachute Center was not in good standing due to falling behind in their payment of taxes, rents, and other obligations, and they had until May 15th to get things in order. A few weeks later, on June 5th, the state sent the Oahu Parachute Center an application to get a permit for skydiving operations. However, they never got a response. And on June 26, 5 days after the crash that killed 10 skydivers, the state sent George a letter saying that the Hawaii Parachute Center failed to get consent to operate skydiving activities and never registered the aircraft they were flying, and they had 5 days to vacate the airport property. At that point, 10 lives had already been lost, and it's just absolutely unbelievable how something like this can happen and the lack of oversight from everyone involved. But now that you understand why there was no excuse for any of this, here's what the eyewitnesses said. When it came to Jerome's behavior, one of the pilots that knew him and had flown with him said that Jerome would bank hard and pitch up aggressively during departures as a thrill ride for the passengers. He also said Jerome would do negative G dives for the weightless effect for fun, but heard some of the jumpers would complain. He went on to claim that Jerome told him he had done barrel rolls in the airplane, but not with passengers, and when he talked to Jerome about doing these things, he said that Jerome's response was always that the passengers seemed to like it and didn't complain to him. There was also a pilot that worked for another skydiving operation at the airfield who said that he observed Jerome fly normal takeoffs and landings, but in the last weeks he noticed Jerome changed his takeoff profile and appeared to be showing off. Specifically, he would stay in ground effect and accelerate, then he would pitch up and bank simultaneously, sometimes at bank angles greater than 45 degrees. On the day before the accident, a major in the Royal Canadian Air Force who had 4,000 hours of flight time and who had been through flight safety training was sitting near the departure end of the runway waiting to watch the sunset, and he recalled seeing the aircraft performing a remarkably aggressive left turn during one of the takeoffs that he thought looked dangerous. On the day of the crash, 3 of the skydivers that were on the jump flight with Jerome prior to the accident flight provided statements to the NTSB. One of them said that during the flight the takeoff wasn't alarming, but the bank angle was enough for him to notice. Another jumper said the left turn occurred at a lower altitude than he expected and was more aggressive than what he considered normal, and that Jerome briefly relaxed the turn before resuming the more aggressive turn. The third jumper, who also happened to be a pilot, said the plane banked a little hard on a high-rate turn at a seemingly low altitude that was a little spicy for their liking. This is why normalization of deviance is so dangerous. Now, my guess is that Jerome probably didn't start off as a reckless pilot, but over time he started pushing the limits, and without any oversight to keep him in line, it became easier and easier for him to deviate from that norm until he was recklessly putting everyone's life in danger. Video from a skydiver on board the first jump flight that afternoon with Jerome showed that he flew past the beach park and then began a hard left turn and flew over the spot that would eventually become the crash site. Even though the beginning of the takeoff wasn't shown in the video, the evidence was consistent with an intersection departure on this flight, as well as the accident flight that followed. It's not clear why Jerome chose to perform an intersection departure when he could have easily taken off from the displaced threshold, and that would have provided him plenty of room to depart over the beach like normal. The NTSB concluded that after Jerome began his intersection takeoff, the aircraft would have been about 100 feet above the ground when it got to the displaced threshold for runway 26. That's when he started an aggressive turn to the left, just like on previous flights. Based on the location of the wreckage and the turn radius of the aircraft, he needed at least 66 degrees of bank in the turn, which would have resulted in an accelerated stall. This is where the pilot pulls back on the controls so quickly that you rapidly exceed the critical angle of attack, usually without getting a stall warning. And when you have 66 degrees of left bank, the left wing is going to drop rapidly and the aircraft will start to roll inverted as if it's going to enter a spin, assuming there was enough altitude. Unfortunately, 3 to 5 of the skydivers weren't wearing their seatbelts when the plane crashed. The reason this is important is because if some of those unsecured passengers slid toward the back of the plane when Jerome made that aggressive pitch up and turn to the left, that weight shift would have resulted in an even further aft center of gravity, resulting in even less time to react to a stall. Additionally, because the left wing was twisted, that slight change to the shape of the wing, combined with the left wing down trim, reduced the stall margin on that side, meaning the left wing would stall before the right, giving the airplane a left rolling tendency. Despite all of the reckless mistakes and arguably some criminal negligence, the sad truth is that even with an intersection takeoff, if Jerome had performed a gentle 20-degree bank turn, he would have easily avoided an accelerated stall and probably flown right over the spot where he crashed, and everyone would probably still be alive today. Although the NTSB determined the probable cause was Jerome's aggressive takeoff maneuver, which resulted in an accelerated stall, they also listed several contributing factors that we've already talked about in this video. However, the point I want to make is that even though Jerome made several reckless mistakes, I think that pretty much everyone that had anything to do with this aircraft played a role in what happened. That's probably why in 2021, the families of 5 of the skydivers filed a lawsuit against the Oahu Parachute Center and its owner, as well as the owner of the aircraft, the contract mechanic, the state of Hawaii, and 70 other individuals that were not identified. I wasn't able to find an update on the lawsuit, but I hope they get the justice they deserved. And I know this was a long debrief, and I appreciate you sticking around to the end. Be sure to let me know your thoughts about what happened in this tragedy, and when you're done, check out one of these other videos on the screen, and thanks so much for your support.